Many people think of the past as a simpler time. But not all things are what they seem. The dinners served in the 1970s Soviet Union were more than just food. They were secret codes for survival. We are about to uncover 20 of these forgotten meals and reveal the shocking story of hardship and genius hidden inside every single bite. 1. Mimosa salad. Let's start our journey with something that looks delicate and pretty, but holds a secret. It is called mimosa salad. The reason for the name is that its top layer, made of crumbled egg yolks, looks like the bright yellow mimosa flowers that bloom in the spring. It was a dish that appeared on almost every holiday table, right next to the fancier dishes people tried to make. It looked cheerful and bright, a spot of sunshine during long, gray winters. But the thing nobody tells you is that this beautiful salad was a master of disguise. Underneath that sunny yellow top was a very different story. The main ingredient was not some fancy chicken or expensive ham. Instead, it was humble canned fish. Usually, it was a cheap kind of fish packed in oil. The layers of the salad, which included grated potatoes, carrots, onions, and hard-boiled eggs, were all held together by a thick layer of mayonnaise between each one. You see, mayonnaise was a key food in the Soviet kitchen. It could make anything taste richer and more satisfying. The mimosa salad was a perfect example of this. It took cheap, everyday ingredients like root vegetables and canned fish and transformed them into something festive. What many overlooked was that this salad was a genius solution to a common problem. It allowed a family to create a celebratory dish without needing rare or expensive items. It was a true wow factor of resourcefulness. It's amazing how a simple dish could be so clever. But if you think a salad made of canned fish is strange, the next dish on our list takes the idea of layering to a whole new, and some might say bizarre, level. 2. Herring under a fur coat. This next dish has a name that sounds like something out of a fairy tale. It is called herring under a fur coat, or shuba for short. It is perhaps one of the most famous and visually striking dishes from that era. When you see it on a table, it looks like a beautiful pink or purple cake. It is a layered salad, much like the mimosa, but the ingredients are even more surprising. The bottom layer is made of salted herring, a very common and affordable fish. But it's the layers on top that create the famous fur coat. Above the herring, you have layers of chopped onions, grated boiled potatoes, and grated carrots. But the final, most important layer is made of grated beets. The beets give the salad its incredible magenta color. And of course, every single layer is glued together with a generous amount of mayonnaise. Many people are crazy about this dish even today, but it was a true staple of the 1970s. To put it mildly, it was a work of art born from necessity. The story goes that a clever cook invented it to create a hearty snack that would also help people not get too tipsy from drinking vodka during celebrations. The potatoes and vegetables were supposed to soak everything up. What many overlooked is the sheer genius of the combination. The salty, oily fish is perfectly balanced by the sweetness of the beets and the starchy potatoes. It's a complete meal in a single slice. It looks incredibly fancy, but at its heart, it's just a clever way to combine cheap root vegetables and preserved fish into something unforgettable. The love for beets was strong, but the next dish used them in a completely different way, creating a salad that was all about health and simplicity, with a surprising French connection. 3. Vinaigrette salad. Not every salad from the Soviet 70s was loaded with mayonnaise. There was another, much simpler salad that was a staple on everyday dinner tables. It was called vinaigrette. The name sounds a lot like the French word vinaigrette, which is a type of salad dressing. But the Soviet vinaigrette salad was something else entirely. Its most striking feature is its bright, ruby red color. That color comes from its main ingredient, boiled beets. The salad is a simple mix of diced boiled vegetables. Along with the beets, it always had boiled potatoes and carrots. What gave it a tangy crunch was the addition of pickles and sometimes sauerkraut. To finish it off, it was dressed with a little bit of sunflower oil, not mayonnaise. You see, this salad was the perfect winter dish. All of its main ingredients, like beets, potatoes, and carrots, were root vegetables that could be stored for months after the autumn harvest. Pickles and sauerkraut were also staples of preservation. So, even in the middle of the coldest winter, a family could make a fresh, crunchy salad that was packed with vitamins. It was a simple and cheap way to stay healthy. The thing nobody tells you is how important these kinds of simple, vegetable-based dishes were. When fresh greens were impossible to find, a bowl of colorful vinaigrette was a welcome sight. It was a reminder of the summer harvest and a promise of health. It was simple, it was healthy, and it was everywhere. This salad was a healthy choice, but the most famous Soviet salad of all started as a luxurious dish for the rich before it was completely transformed into something everyone could eat. 4. Olivier salad. If there is one dish that represents the Soviet holiday table, it is the Olivier salad. To this day, it is a required dish for any major celebration, especially New Year's Eve. But not all things are what they seem. The version of Olivier salad that became famous in the 1970s was a shadow of its former self, a perfect symbol of how the country had changed. The original salad was invented in the 1800s by a Belgian chef in Moscow named Lucien Olivier. His version was incredibly fancy. It had expensive ingredients like roasted grouse, veal tongue, and even crayfish tails. The dressing was a secret recipe that he never shared. It was a dish for the richest people in the country. Fast forward to the 1970s. The name Olivier salad was still used, but the recipe had been completely transformed. The fancy meats were gone. In their place, people used boiled potatoes, carrots, pickles, and hard-boiled eggs. And for the protein, they used a simple boiled sausage, similar to bologna. The most crucial ingredient that was added was a huge amount of canned sweet peas. The whole thing was mixed together with, you guessed it, a lot of mayonnaise. What many overlooked is that this transformation tells a bigger story. The Soviet Olivier salad took the name of something exclusive and made it for everyone. It became a symbol of shared celebration. Every family had their own slight variation of the recipe. It was a dish that was truly for the people, even if its ancestor was a meal for kings. The salads of the era were true marvels of creativity. But now we must turn to the heart of the Russian table, the soups. And the first one is a world-famous classic that also had to adapt to the times. 5. Borscht. Everyone has heard of borscht. It is the famous deep red beet soup that is a symbol of Eastern European cooking. But the borscht that was commonly made in the 1970s had a few secrets of its own. While the dish itself has never been forgotten, the specific way it was made back then is not as common today, because people had to rely on preserved ingredients. The heart of a good borscht is a rich broth, usually made with beef, and a mix of vegetables like cabbage, potatoes, carrots, and onions. The star of the show, of course, is the beets, which give the soup its signature color and sweet, earthy flavor. A dollop of sour cream on top is absolutely required. It adds a cool, tangy creaminess that cuts through the richness of the soup. The thing nobody tells you is that getting fresh, high-quality ingredients year-round was a challenge. For example, fresh, ripe tomatoes were a summer luxury. So, for most of the year, home cooks relied on tomato paste from a can to give their borscht its tangy, acidic kick. This canned tomato paste became a standard part of the flavor profile for the soup made during that time. You see, every spoonful told a story of the seasons. A summer borscht might be lighter and full of fresh herbs from a garden. A winter borscht would be heartier, relying on stored root vegetables and canned goods. It was a dish that adapted, a warm and comforting bowl that could be made no matter what the grocery store shelves looked like. Borscht was the king of beet soups, but it had a close cousin, another cabbage-based soup that was just as important, but with a much tangier, more aggressive flavor. 6. Shchi. While borscht is famous for its beets, there is another ancient soup that is just as important to Russian cuisine. It is called shchi. You can think of it as borscht's older, more sour cousin. The main difference is that shchi has no beets. Its soul comes from one key ingredient, cabbage. There are many ways to make shchi. In the summer, it can be made with fresh green cabbage. But the most common version, especially in the 1970s, was made with sauerkraut. The Russian word for it is kvashenaya kapusta. This sour fermented cabbage gave the soup an incredible, tangy flavor that is impossible to replicate with fresh cabbage. To put it mildly, shchi, made from sauerkraut, was a lifesaver. Sauerkraut was one of the most important preserved foods. It could last through the entire winter, providing much-needed vitamin C when no fresh vegetables were available. A big pot of shchi was warm, filling, and incredibly cheap to make. It would usually have some potatoes and carrots in it, and if a family was lucky, a piece of meat to make a rich broth. What many overlooked is that this soup was a taste of history. It has been a staple of the Russian diet for over 1,000 years. It was a food for everyone, from the poorest peasants to the richest tsars. In the 1970s, it continued its long reign as a comforting, reliable meal that could always be counted on to fill bellies and warm souls. Soups were the heart of the meal, but the main courses were where cooks had to be the most clever, especially when it came to the most precious ingredient of all: meat. 7. Kotlety. Imagine a hamburger patty, but one that is juicier, softer, and often not made entirely of meat. That is the Soviet kotlety. These were not the kind of burgers you would find at an American barbecue. They were a staple of home cooking and were served in cafeterias all across the country. They were the answer to the question of how to make a little bit of meat go a long way. Kotlety were typically made from ground meat, usually a mix of pork and beef. But here is the secret. The meat was almost always mixed with other ingredients to stretch it out. The most common addition was a piece of stale white bread that had been soaked in milk. This made the kotlety incredibly soft and moist. Sometimes, grated raw onion or garlic was added for flavor. In some versions, rice or even grated potatoes were mixed in. You see, this was not just about saving money. Many people believed that these additions actually made the kotlety taste better. It gave them a unique soft texture that was very different from a pure meat patty. They were usually pan-fried until they had a beautiful brown crust on the outside while staying tender on the inside. The thing nobody tells you is how versatile they were. Kotlety could be served with almost anything. The most common side dish was mashed potatoes, or buckwheat kasha. They were pure comfort food, a satisfying and reliable meal that every family knew how to make. It was a dish that represented the art of making more from less. Stretching meat in a patty was one trick, but an even more popular method involved wrapping that precious meat inside a delicate doughy package. 8. Pelmeni. If there is one dish that can be called the national food of Russia, it might be pelmeni. These are small dumplings, usually filled with a mixture of ground pork, beef, and onion. They are like little pockets of savory goodness, and they have a special place in the heart of the culture. Many people are crazy about making pelmeni from scratch. It is often a family activity where everyone gathers around the table to fold and fill hundreds of these little dumplings. The thing nobody tells you is about the tradition of freezing them. In places like Siberia, families would make massive batches of pelmeni and then store them outside in the snow. They were like a natural frozen dinner, ready to be boiled up at a moment's notice. In the 1970s, pelmeni were a go-to meal. You could buy them frozen in bags from the store, and they were incredibly easy to prepare. All you had to do was boil them in salted water for a few minutes. The traditional way to eat them is with a big dollop of sour cream or a splash of vinegar. But a popular way to serve them back then, especially in public cafeterias, was in a simple tomato sauce. It was often just a basic sauce made from tomato paste, water, and some spices. This added a different kind of flavor, a bit of tanginess that went well with the rich meat filling. Pelmeni were the ultimate convenience food, a quick and hearty meal that was always a comforting choice. Pelmeni were king of the meat dumplings, but they had a close relative that was just as beloved, but often filled with something completely different. 9. Vareniki. At first glance, vareniki look almost exactly like pelmeni. They are both dumplings made from a simple, unleavened dough, but there is a crucial difference. While pelmeni are almost always filled with raw meat, vareniki can be filled with a huge variety of ingredients, and they are often sweet instead of savory. However, the user's list mentions a meat version, which was also a common dish. Meat-filled vareniki were a bit different from pelmeni. The filling was usually made from pre-cooked meat, perhaps leftovers from another meal, which was then ground up and mixed with fried onions. This gave them a deeper, more roasted flavor compared to the boiled taste of pelmeni filling. But the most popular vareniki fillings were not meat. The two classic savory options were potatoes, often mixed with fried onions or mushrooms, and farmer's cheese, which is a bit like cottage cheese. On the sweet side, the most beloved filling was cherries. Sweet cherry vareniki, boiled and served with sugar and sour cream, were a treasured summer treat. You see, vareniki represented another kind of resourcefulness. They were a perfect way to use up leftovers or to make a hearty meal from the simplest ingredients like potatoes. In the 1970s, A big plate of potato vareniki with fried onions was a cheap, filling, and delicious dinner. It was a dish that could be whatever you needed it to be, savory or sweet, a main course or a dessert. From the heart of Russia, we now travel south to Central Asia for a rice dish that became a beloved part of the entire Soviet food landscape. 10. Plov. Plov is a hearty rice pilaf that is the national dish of Uzbekistan and other countries in Central Asia. But its popularity spread far and wide across the Soviet Union, and it became a favorite for family dinners and special occasions. The reason is simple. It is a delicious, one-pot meal that can feed a lot of people. A traditional plov is made in a special cast-iron pot called a kazan. It starts with pieces of meat, usually lamb or beef, which are browned in a good amount of oil. Then a huge amount of onions and yellow carrots are added and cooked until they are soft and sweet. The rice is then added on top along with water, and the whole thing is steamed until the rice is perfectly cooked and has absorbed all the flavors from the meat and vegetables. The thing nobody tells you is that there are hundreds of variations of plov. Some versions, especially those made for celebrations, would include other ingredients like chickpeas or whole heads of garlic tucked into the rice. A very popular addition mentioned in the user's list was raisins. The sweetness of the raisins provided a wonderful contrast to the savory meat and vegetables. In the 1970s, making a truly authentic plov could be difficult if you could not find the right cut of lamb, but home cooks adapted. They would make it with beef or even chicken. What mattered was the method. The slow cooking process allowed simple ingredients to develop deep, complex flavors. It was a taste of the sunny South that brought warmth to kitchens all over the country. One-pot meals like plov were a blessing. But the next dish is a soup that takes the idea of a one-pot meal to the extreme. A wild combination of ingredients that sounds like a mess but tastes like a miracle. 11. Solyanka. If you were to look at a recipe for solyanka soup, you might think it was a joke. It is a true, everything but the kitchen sink kind of soup. It is a perfect example of a dish that could have only been born in a place where you had to be creative with whatever ingredients you could find. Solyanka is a thick, sour, and salty soup that is packed with an incredible amount of flavor. There are three main types of solyanka. One made with meat, one with fish, and one with mushrooms. The meat version was especially popular in the 1970s. The base of the soup is a rich broth, but the fillings are where things get wild. A single pot of solyanka could contain several different kinds of meat and sausage products. Think sliced hot dogs, pieces of bologna, bits of smoked sausage, and maybe some leftover boiled beef. But the meat is only half the story. What gives solyanka its signature sour and salty taste is the addition of pickles. And not just the pickles themselves, but a splash of the pickle brine from the jar. To add even more flavor, the soup is loaded with olives or capers and a bit of tomato paste. It is served with a slice of lemon and a spoonful of sour cream. To put it mildly, the flavor is intense. It is a powerful combination of savory, sour, and salty. It was the perfect soup to make at the end of the week, a way to use up all the little bits and pieces of meat and sausage left in the refrigerator. It was a masterpiece of leftover cooking. Solyanka used pickles for its sour flavor, but our next soup takes that idea even further, making pickles the absolute star of the show. 12. Rosolnik. Imagine a soup whose main flavor comes from pickles. It sounds strange, but that is the secret behind rosolnik, another classic soup from the Russian kitchen. The name of the soup comes from the Russian word rasol, which means brine or pickle juice. This ingredient is what makes this soup completely unique. Rosolnik is a hearty and comforting soup. It typically starts with a broth made from beef or chicken. The two other required ingredients that define the soup are pearl barley and, of course, pickles. The pearl barley gives the soup a wonderful, chewy texture and makes it very filling. The pickles are diced and added to the soup, but the real magic comes from adding a cup of the pickle brine towards the end of cooking. You see, the pickle brine adds a delicious, tangy flavor that brightens up the entire soup. It is a sourness that is different from the tang of shki or the sourness of solyanka. It has a distinct, pickly taste that is surprisingly delicious. The soup is rounded out with the usual root vegetables like potatoes and carrots. What many overlooked is that this soup was also considered to be a great folk remedy. It was believed to be the perfect cure after a night of too much celebrating. The salty, briny broth was thought to help rehydrate the body. In the 1970s, it was just a good old-fashioned, comforting soup that was both delicious and incredibly cheap to make. From complex soups we moved to a dish of shocking simplicity, a pasta meal so basic it became a legend in its own right. 13. Navy macaroni. This dish is probably the simplest main course on our entire list. It is called Navy macaroni, or macaroni po-flotsky. The name tells you everything you need to know about its origins. It was a staple food for sailors in the Soviet Navy because it was easy to make in huge quantities with non-perishable ingredients. It quickly became a favorite meal for busy families as well. The recipe is incredibly simple. It consists of two main ingredients: pasta and meat. The pasta was usually a type of macaroni or other short pasta shape. The meat was ground beef that was simply fried in a pan with some chopped onions. Then, the cooked pasta was mixed in with the meat, and that was it. The dish was ready. The thing nobody tells you is that the most authentic version of this dish was made with canned, stewed meat called tushonka. This was a staple of military rations and was also something many families kept in their pantry for emergencies. The tushonka, which was meat preserved in its own fat, would be heated in a pan until the fat melted, and then the cooked pasta would be stirred in. Many people might think this sounds too plain, but there was a comforting, simple goodness to it. It was a hearty, filling meal that could be on the table in under 30 minutes. For a busy mother in the 1970s, it was the perfect weeknight dinner. It was the Soviet equivalent of spaghetti with meat sauce, but much, much simpler. Pasta was a beloved quick meal, but an even more common side dish and main course was a vegetable that was the undisputed king of the Russian garden. 14. Stewed cabbage. Cabbage was one of the most important vegetables in the Soviet diet. It was cheap, it grew almost everywhere, and it could be stored for a long time. People ate it fresh in salads, fermented it into sauerkraut, and used it in soups like shi and borscht. Another very popular way to prepare it was to simply stew it. Stewed cabbage, or tushenaya kapusta, was a common side dish, and sometimes even a main course. The recipe was simple. Shredded cabbage was slowly cooked in a pot with some onions and carrots. For flavor, a bit of tomato paste and a bay leaf were usually added. The cabbage was cooked until it was very soft and tender, and all the flavors had melded together. To make it a more substantial main dish, other ingredients could be added. A popular addition was some sliced sausage or a bit of leftover meat. This would turn the simple vegetable dish into a complete one-pot meal. It was a warm, savory, and incredibly comforting dish, especially on a cold day. You see, dishes like stewed cabbage were the backbone of the everyday diet. They were not fancy or exciting, but they were reliable. They were a way to create a warm and filling meal from the most basic and affordable ingredients. What many overlooked is that this simple dish provided a lot of nutrition and was a healthy way to fill up a plate. Cabbage was the star of many humble dishes, but it was also used to wrap around other ingredients, creating little parcels of flavor, as we see in our next forgotten classic. 15. Golubtsi. Golubtsi are stuffed cabbage rolls, a dish that is popular all across Eastern Europe. The name translates to little pigeons, which might be a reference to their shape. They were another genius way to use the ever-present cabbage and to make a small amount of meat feed an entire family. Making golubtsi was a bit of a project, but the delicious results were always worth the effort. The process starts with a whole head of cabbage. The large outer leaves are carefully removed and then boiled for a few minutes to make them soft and pliable. The filling is typically a mixture of ground beef and rice, along with some sautéed onions and carrots. A spoonful of this filling is placed on a cabbage leaf, which is then carefully rolled up into a neat little package. These cabbage rolls are then placed snugly in a large pot. The thing nobody tells you is what happens next. The rolls are covered with a simple tomato-based sauce, often thinned out sour cream mixed with tomato paste. The pot is then covered, and the golubtsi are slowly simmered until the cabbage is tender and the filling is cooked through. To put it mildly, the aroma that fills the kitchen is incredible. The slow cooking process makes the cabbage sweet and tender, and the rice in the filling absorbs all the delicious flavors of the meat and the sauce. They were a perfect Sunday dinner, a dish that showed a little extra love and care. So far, many of the dishes have been hearty and warm, but our next dish is a soup that is not just cold, it is shockingly refreshing. and a true sign that summer has arrived. 16. Okroshka. Imagine a hot summer day. You are hungry, but the idea of eating a hot meal is unbearable. In the Soviet Union, there was a perfect solution for this. It is a cold soup called okroshka. For people who have never tried it, the list of ingredients might sound like a very strange experiment. Okroshka is basically a chopped salad that is turned into a soup. The solid ingredients are a mix of chopped boiled potatoes, hard-boiled eggs, and fresh vegetables like cucumbers and radishes. For protein, it usually has chopped boiled sausage, similar to what is used in Olivier salad. A huge amount of fresh dill and green onions are also required. But here is where things get really interesting. All of these chopped ingredients are put into a bowl, and then a cold liquid is poured over them. There are two traditional liquids used for okroshka. The first is kvass, a fermented rye bread drink that has a slightly sour and sweet taste. The second option, which is just as popular, is kefir, a fermented milk drink that is similar to a thin yogurt. You see, the combination of the crunchy vegetables, the savory sausage, and the tangy cold liquid is incredibly refreshing. It is a dish that makes perfect sense on a hot day. In the 1970s, when air conditioning was not common, a bowl of cold okroshka was the best way to cool down and have a satisfying meal at the same time. From a strange cold soup, we turn to a food that is the very definition of a staple, a humble grain that was a cornerstone of the Soviet diet. 17. Kasha with mushrooms. The word kasha in Russian can refer to any kind of porridge made from grains. But most of the time, when someone says kasha, they are talking about one specific grain: buckwheat. Buckwheat kasha was, without a doubt, one of the most important foods in the Soviet Union. It was cheap, incredibly nutritious, and very easy to cook. Buckwheat has a unique, nutty, and earthy flavor. It is prepared by simply simmering the toasted groats in water until they are soft and fluffy. It could be eaten plain as a simple side dish for almost any meal. It was also a popular breakfast food, served with milk and a little sugar. But one of the most beloved ways to eat it was as a savory main course, mixed with fried mushrooms and onions. The thing nobody tells you is how important mushrooms were. Foraging for wild mushrooms in the forest was a national pastime. Families would spend weekends picking mushrooms and then preserve them for the winter by drying or pickling them. A dish of buckwheat kasha with fried mushrooms and onions was a classic comfort food. The earthy flavor of the buckwheat paired perfectly with the savory mushrooms. It was a simple, rustic dish that was deeply satisfying. It was also a great vegetarian meal in a diet that was often heavy on meat and starch. Kasha was more than just food. It was a symbol of home and health. Kasha was a meal in a bowl, but sometimes you wanted your food to be portable. The next dish is the perfect example of a savory, handheld snack that was loved by all. 18. Pirozhki with potatoes. Pirozhki are small baked or fried buns that can be filled with a variety of ingredients. They are the ultimate Russian street food and a staple of home baking. You could find them everywhere, from street carts to school cafeterias. They are the perfect little snack to eat on the go. The dough for pirozhki can be a simple yeast dough or a quicker pastry-like dough. The choice of fillings is almost endless. Popular savory fillings included ground meat, cabbage, or mushrooms. Sweet versions could be filled with fruit preserves or sweet cheese, but perhaps the most common and beloved filling of all, especially in the 1970s, was simple mashed potatoes. Potato-filled pirozhki were a perfect food for the times. Potatoes were cheap and always available. The filling was just mashed potatoes, often mixed with some fried onions for extra flavor. The buns would be formed, filled, and then either baked in the oven until golden brown or fried in a pan until crispy. What many overlooked is that these little pies were another way to make a meal out of very little. They were filling, they were cheap, and they were delicious. A couple of warm potato pirozhki and a glass of tea was a perfectly acceptable lunch or light dinner. They were a small, humble package of pure comfort. Most dishes used meat or vegetables, but the Soviet Union also had a surprising focus on fish, which led to the creation of our next unique dish. 19. Fish cutlets. We already talked about kotlety made from meat. But there was another version of this dish that was just as common, if not more so. These were fish cutlets, or ribni kotleti. Their popularity was thanks to a government policy that created what was known as Fish Day. You see, in an effort to boost the country's fishing industry and encourage people to eat more fish, the government declared that every Thursday, public cafeterias should primarily serve fish dishes. This meant that on Thursdays, all across the Soviet Union, the menu would feature things like fish soup, fried fish, and of course fish cutlets. The thing nobody tells you is that these cutlets were usually made from very cheap and common types of white fish, like pollock or cod. The fish would be ground up and, just like the meat version, mixed with milk-soaked bread and onions to make it go further and to give it a softer texture. They were then formed into patties, coated in breadcrumbs and fried. To put it mildly, the quality of these cutlets could vary. Sometimes they were delicious, and other times they could be a bit dry or have a strong fishy taste. But they became a regular part of the weekly diet. They were often served with a side of mashed potatoes and a pickle. They are a true taste of a very specific time and a very specific government policy. We end our journey with a classic dish that combines two Soviet obsessions, fancy-sounding names and humble canned ingredients. 20. Beef stroganoff. Our final dish is another one that, like the Olivier salad, has a noble past. Beef stroganoff is a famous Russian dish of sautéed pieces of beef served in a sour cream sauce. It was named after a wealthy and powerful family, the Stroganovs, in the 19th century. It was a dish of refined elegance. By the 1970s, beef stroganoff was still considered a nice meal, something you might make for guests, but the recipe had been simplified for the home cook. The original versions might have called for expensive beef tenderloin. The Soviet home-cook version used much more affordable cuts of beef, like flank steak or chuck roast. The key to the dish was cutting the beef into very thin strips. This allowed the tougher meat to cook quickly and become tender. The beef was usually dredged in flour and then fried with onions. The sauce was the star. It was a simple but delicious combination of sour cream or smetana and a bit of tomato paste. You see, this dish felt luxurious even when it was made with simple ingredients. The creamy, tangy sauce made it feel special. What many overlooked is how quickly it could be made. It was a fast and elegant dinner. The most common way to serve it was over pasta or with a side of fried potatoes. It was a taste of old-world luxury that had been adapted to fit into the reality of everyday life. It was a fitting end to our culinary journey, a dish that held onto its fancy name while becoming a meal for everyone.